Hi, thanks to all of you for being here, and thank you to this incredible panel of mayors for being here as well. We are here to talk about gun violence. This panel is called Fighting Fire, Cities Stand Against Gun Violence. We all know the statistics, right? Nearly 40,000 Americans killed every year with guns, an additional 100,000 wounded every year. The national debate, I think we can all agree, kind of overshadows often what's happening on the front lines when it comes to gun violence, and that's what we want to talk about today, is what local leaders can and are doing to combat gun violence in their own communities. So I'd love to just go down the line and kind of set the table with this conversation to talk about, of all the issues that you struggle with every day, that you manage every day in your communities. Mayor Fischer, let's start with you. Why is it that you wanted to come here to talk about gun violence in particular?
Well, when you think about who gun violence impacts in our community, I mean, the facts are we're losing 100 people a day throughout the United States right now. And just think about that slow drumbeat of death that's happening to where most of us in America have become desensitized to this type. So if we were losing 100 soldiers a day, I mean, the whole country would be saying, what is it that we're going to do about this? So in our community, to me, it's a fight for the soul of what we stand for. In most cities, that daily drumbeat usually includes a young man or boy of color, where there'll be 20 guys like that killed today, if it's an average day in our country. So when we get our attention because of the massacres that are taking place, those are the sensationalized headlines. But what about the one guy in Louisville, or the two guys in San Jose, or wherever it might be, and where's the outrage over that? So I think that's a real fight for the soul of our country, to say, does everybody count in our country? And the answer should be yes. So what is it that we're doing about that? So that's one of the major reasons why we focus on that. And plus, the job of a mayor is to keep people alive for a long time and be healthy. So it obviously gets in the way of what we're doing. So for me, I start with a moral argument that this just is not right, the conditions in our country. So how do you bring the power of the mayor's office against this challenge?
Mayor De Lisla, what about you?
Well, Topeka, Kansas had last year one of the most grueling years for us. I mean, we had 27 shootings that resulted in deaths in our community, and they were all amongst individuals of color, very sadly, and it was gang-related. But I think that in addition to that, we were talking about this backstage. I will never forget getting a text message from my daughter saying, "Mom, we are hiding in my school. There is an active shooter outside." And Lorraine's school is 2 blocks away from my house. And we don't live in the most affluent neighborhood, but we live in a really good neighborhood. And the trauma that my daughter has had from that situation, it's everywhere. And I think that as we start thinking in our communities, I was talking to one of my emergency management people, and he said, we have to stop thinking of if it happens in our community. We have to be prepared for when. And to think that that is what we're having to think of, that our children are having to think of when they go to school, that our neighbors are having to think of when they're living in the sanctity of their home, is just not acceptable.
Mayor Liccardo, it's not an if in your community, right? You've had to face what mayors would consider to be their worst nightmare when you had a shooting in your own community.
Well, certainly. And, for many years we've been working on safe gun storage laws and many other ordinances, really nibbling at the edges. But then when obviously a horrible mass shooting happens in or around your community, it becomes much more real. And in our case, in the summertime, we lost 6-year-old Stephen and 13-year-old Kayla, along with others in a Gilroy shooting. And although Gilroy is a town just outside of San Jose, they're our residents, of course. We sent 100 cops down there to try to find the shooter. And you just realize the extraordinary disruption that happens in the life of a community, and obviously the horror to the family. And, after just reading so many messages from Washington about prayers, you just realize it's time for us to actually do something. And fortunately, at the local level, there are things we can do. And that's why I decided to really dig in on this issue.
And I want to stick with you for a second, because what you proposed within weeks of that shooting was pretty novel. And if and when it goes into place, it would be among the more strict measures across the country. But you're asking that gun owners would be required to buy liability insurance, right? Tell me about how that would help curb gun violence.
Yeah, and it's actually not my idea. A couple folks have tried to propose this at the legislative level in New York and in California, but it hadn't succeeded. It was right after Sandy Hook. Essentially, our view is that we know the public bears the cost of gun violence in so many ways, And if gun owners essentially are receiving an unfair subsidy for their ownership, and that cost is not borne by them in some way, then we are incentivizing gun ownership. And it seems to me that what we ought to be doing, if we have 40,000 deaths a year from automobile accidents, and similarly about 40,000 deaths a year from gun violence, and we require automobile drivers to carry insurance, there's no reason why gun owners should not also have insurance. And the hope is that insurance could incentivize people to do the right things if they are going to own guns. That is, buy the safes and ensure that there are child-safe locks and ensure that people take gun safety training, et cetera, that will help reduce their premiums.
Mayor DeLisa, we talked a little bit about this backstage, but even nationally, we've seen the role that young people have played when it comes to at least even changing the conversation and getting people to focus on gun violence. I was looking up statistics in Topeka. People between the ages of 25 and 44 make up the largest age group, and people under 18 make up another quarter of the population. How are you accessing that energy or the willingness to have the conversation, leveraging that community?
So I have been involved in youth initiatives for many years. We actually have a girls' conference that's been going on for 11 years. Over 200 girls come to that conference. But in addition to that, I think that the more meaningful thing that we're doing is that we have an amazing youth council. And I don't set the agenda. My role is to run the meeting as the mayor, like I would with my council. But they set the agenda, and I bring the resources. And they had 3 things that they wanted to discuss this year. The first meeting was place setting. The second meeting was mental health. The third meeting was gun violence. And it was empowering. We invited every single person at the federal level for the Shawnee County delegation, the city, and the county. And only one person showed up from the state. Our federal delegation was in session, and nobody else showed up. However, from that conversation, it was amazing the insight that they got from our chief of police and from the representative that were there. And they are so excited about the information they have received that the plan that we have is that we're going to gather information, match it up with national things that are best practices. Because, I mean, nobody is against guns. We are about gun sense. And they're going to write a resolution to present it not only to the city, to the council, to the state, and provide that resolution with their ideas to the federal level as well.
And do you find that that has support within the rest of the community too? Does everyone feel the same way that the youth council does?
I think that in Kansas, it's a very different conversation. I think that when you talk to children, to youth, the conversation, absolutely. In the young people, when you talk to the college students, they're concerned. Yeah. I mean, we had a very tragic loss. Corey Ballantyne was shot in my community, and then may DeJuan Johnson rest in peace. He was his football mate that they were in a party and something tragic happened. So we have that. I don't think that the adults are quite as keyed in as our young people are to this issue.
What about you, Mayor Fischer? Now, you are in a unique position because you cannot take any action if the state doesn't support that action, right? You can't take that locally on your own.
I'm preempted from any action to the point where if I do take action, I'm legally held liable for, I think it's a Class D felony, as a matter of fact, to show you how absurd some of this happens in states where you have, really red legislators that want to basically hug the gun and say we don't have gun problems. So we're limited in what we can do that way. But I'm not limited in terms of using the pulpit that a mayor has to create outrage in a community over the situation that leads to all these deaths that are taking place across our country. So one of the ways that we can do that is to educate folks. So at the beginning of the school year, a grandmother approached me and asked me if I thought it was a good idea for her to buy a bulletproof backpack for her young grandchild that was starting kindergarten. I'm sure that took place all over the community. So imagine how you would feel if you're a grandma and your precious 6-year-old is going off to kindergarten and you're having to think about that. And say, that's where we're at in the United States of America right now. Imagine, when I've gone to D.C. and talked to the White House and the Senate, and they say, this is too hard, it's too political to get something like this done. And imagine you're that grandma showing up and your grandchild's body has been ripped apart by assault rifles. So one thing I did was say, wouldn't it make a lot of sense if we trained everybody on how to respond when a bullet rips through your body? Okay, this is a Stop the Bleed kit from the University of Louisville Hospital. It's our trauma hospital. And to make people outraged, I say, you need to know what happens if a gun pierces through somebody that you know or don't know. How to apply the gauze, how to put a tourniquet on here. And people are like, oh my God, this mayor's crazy. I said, no, it is practical, but I want you to be outraged to the point that we demand action from these elected officials. I mean, what's radical is nothing is being done when we lose 100 of our citizens each and every day. That's what's radical.
You mentioned your conversations on the Hill with members of Congress as well. You've come out in support of expanding background checks, passing red flag laws, a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. What are those conversations like with national leaders, with the federal leaders who haven't really acted on any of these yet?
They're sad. I mean, I think it's the idea that America can do nothing about gun violence, I think, is a betrayal to who we are as a country. It's a betrayal to people that fight and lose their lives for us each and every day. It's a betrayal to our public safety officials. And so when you have publicly elected officials in the sanctity and safety of their offices wanting to say this is a difficult thing to do politically and you just don't understand, I think they're the ones that don't understand. And as I said earlier, if we were losing 100 lives to something else every day, we'd be on top of it. So I'm not real optimistic at this level because they're also waiting for the president to do something. And of course, there's a lot of distractions that they have. So it's not acceptable. So this has to become an issue that motivates people to vote, to say, if you're against common sense gun safety reform, you're out of there. And only when people see the power of the voter being more powerful than the power of the NRA and the gun lobby will this thing start turning around.
Mayor Liccardo, you have something specific on the table. You've got this insurance proposal. Tell me about the kind of support that it's gotten, what opposition you're facing, how you're getting people to support it, and what kind of difference you think it makes if and when it goes into place.
Well, we've had great support in the community, wonderful organization. I think many of you have Moms Demand Action organization in your own cities. They are a great base of support for change at the local level, and I'm grateful for every town's support of their efforts. But we know as soon as this becomes an ordinance, we're going to face a challenge in court. The good news is we've had a lot of lawyers stepping up saying, we'll help you out pro bono. We think this is a fight worth fighting, and I think they're right. I'm a recovering lawyer myself, and I'd clear my desk for a case like this.
Mayor De La Isla, you mentioned maybe some tension I picked up there between what the Youth Council is pushing forward and some of the older residents who may not necessarily support some of the same measures. It feels like every time there's another big public mass shooting, we have the conversation again, and everyone says, what can we do and what can be done? It sounds like you've got real ideas and some level of support. So how do you have the conversation with the people who don't necessarily support those same actions? What do you say to them?
So it's very interesting. I have very purposefully engaged my friends that are gun owners to try to understand what the resistance is to even legislation, what the concerns are. And I think that what I get back from the counterparts that do believe in having their weapons is they feel that having a weapon helps save. Like if there's a bad person, me having a weapon can save, and deal with the issue before the police officers come. And the other one that I've heard is, my son uses a semi-automatic weapon when he goes hunting deer. And so there's all this rhetoric. I think that what the sad thing is? I think that for individuals that may have their weapons and they're using it responsibly, which I think that is the conversation that sometimes we don't differentiate. We have individuals that are very safe gun owners, and we don't want to penalize those individuals. We understand that the guns are, the other argument that I get is that, bad people are going to get the guns regardless. How are you going to deal with that? But I think that it's not until people that are not impacted by this have their own experience with somebody that they know and love, that we're not going to get to the place, and it's something that I don't wish on anybody, please understand that, but I don't think that until somebody has that pain, that they'll understand that there is something that has to be done. And the sad part is that at the national level, we have a very powerful arm lobbying for nothing to happen. And until we're able to remove that barrier, I don't think anything's going to happen because people are just set in their ways. So we just need to continue having those very difficult conversations, learning about what the other side is seeing, and then start to figure out what are the things that we can agree upon so that we can at least start moving forward.
I agree with what Michelle said, but I would say that, as cities, we can be a force multiplier. NRA may be able to fight in a focused way in Congress, but what we're able to do individually, they can't match in cities throughout the country. And so that's why I'm just so proud that so many mayors are stepping out on these issues, because I think if we're collectively engaging them, it's going to be a lot harder for them to fight us all.
Well, that was related to my next question to you, was what role do you think you can play? Because the national conversation is where it is, federal inaction is where it is. What role do you think other leaders like yourselves can play in this conversation?
Well, Greg certainly gave a great example of how he can start to change the perspective on the problem by really making people understand in a real way how gun violence affects them. And certainly what we're trying to do, obviously we've got to probably fight it through the courts, we'd expect, but as I believe we have what will be something that will be upheld and constitutional, hopefully other cities and states can follow. All of us have tried ideas and stolen each other's good ideas. I know most of what we implement in San Jose has been stolen from one of my colleagues one way or another, and that's how we make good policy.
Mayor Fischer, you're going to say something. Go
Well, I just think we got to jump up for a minute and say, why do we have so many gun deaths in our country? Well, one, obviously, when you have 400 million guns on the streets of America and access to guns is so plentiful, that talks about the suicide aspect of that. 60% of all these 100 deaths are by suicide by gun, 95% lethality. Most suicide other attempts are like 3%, and they only happen one time, so that's one issue. The second issue is inability for young people in particular to solve disputes. We're seeing an alarming increase in young guys that are doing, social media bullying, that then you've disrespected me, so then it comes out to the street, I can easily get a gun, so we're going to solve it that way. And then the third issue is, when you have gun deaths involved with illegal narcotics trading, it's because people are dealing dope to make a living, and so we need to get to some pathway where people can have a living wage in our country so that their basic needs are set so they don't have to turn to crime to make a living. And they use the gun, obviously, to enforce the law that we have. So these are some of the bigger system issues that are at play, and until we really address those, we all have our violence reduction programs, but I'm afraid we're just kind of moving the chairs around on the ship without really addressing the big system.
We were talking about this backstage. Nothing happens in a silo, right? You mentioned the mental health aspect, the majority of the gun deaths in America as a result of suicide. Do you guys have the resources you need to address all of this holistically, mental health and gun violence and education and all of these things? Do you have what you need?
So I'll speak for Topeka. We have great partners in Family Service and Guidance Center, which is for children, and Vallejo, which is our mental health, community mental health organization. We don't have enough beds. We don't have everything that we need. But I think that I want to echo a little bit on what you just said. I think that we have to talk about the issue of gun violence. The policies are going to help us mitigate some of the issues. But what we need to understand is that at the point in time in which one child has felt that the only way that they could deal with a problem is through violence, we have failed that child as a society. And I think that we have to start taking a look at what we're doing in our communities and how we are supporting conversations and things to occur so that our children don't feel like this is the only recourse to solve a problem. So we have resources, but I don't think that any of our communities are going to have enough resources to ever manage the crisis that we see in our communities with mental health.
I think that's right. No city ever has enough resources. I think, though, increasingly we ought to be expecting that those who own guns will invest in the basic resources we need to keep our children safe. We have 4.6 million children in this country that live in a home with a loaded gun that is unlocked or available, that is not kept in a safe. Now, if we think about that for a moment, 4.6 million children. If we had mandates in every city and every state that you had to keep your gun in a safe and you had to have a child-safe lock on it, think about what we could do around suicide prevention, what we could do around accidental shootings to prevent unnecessary deaths and injuries. It would be tremendous. That doesn't necessarily have to come from the general fund. We just need the courage to be able to move forward.
And
Mayor
these
Fischer,
are-
I'll give you the final word here
Okay,
before we
and
go.
like I said, these are not radical ideas, right? Other countries are showing us that it can work. Why do we have 50 times the amount of gun deaths in our country over any other Western country? So again, we have to break through kind of the forces that are just wrapping themselves around the gun every day. And on one other issue, on do we have the resources? When you see the trauma that not only happens with gun deaths, but from the multiple generations, oftentimes, of the people that are involved using the gun, in the history of trauma in our country, and you think about, are we giving adequate mental health supports from the trauma side? This is not like something where you, okay, I've been traumatized, I'm going to go see my doctor, and after one half-hour session, I'm all good. Okay, this is intensive treatment that's required, both to get myself in balance mentally, but then also to have a hopeful future, hopeful connection to the future as well. So we got a lot of work to do, So we focus a lot on the gun, but let's focus on the downstream stuff that we can do to address the gun issues also.
A lot of work to do. It's a good place to leave the conversation, I think. Mayor Greg Fischer, Mayor Michelle de la Isla, Mayor Sam Liccardo, thank you very much for being here.